Welcome to Enjoy Exceptional Living. I am Lynn Fritz, your program producer and host. This program is in collaboration with Enjoy Magazine, KLXR 1230 AM radio, and myself, a private practice licensed marriage and family therapist. In each of our programs, our intention is to bring you the best of people, places, and projects of Northern California that we think you will enjoy and that we think are exceptional. For many of us, we can recall the 60s and 70s and the Vietnam War, the era of war and conflict across the other side of the world, but also great conflict in our nation about the role of the United States in the Vietnam War. Today in the studio we have three individuals that are going to share with us their history of how they came to be in the United States, their family history, their personal history, and to share with us another part of the war that many people are not aware of. So we are going to be talking about today the Secret War. So in the studio I have David Saechao, who is the co-chair for the Shasta County Mien community, and Philip and Mickey Chao. Philip is Mien and Mickey is Laotian, and we're going to hear about their family stories, why they reside in the United States. So I want to begin by asking David Saechao to share with us what is meant by the Secret War.
Thank you, Lynn. Well, one of the things about the Secret War and why it was kept secret had a lot to do with the Geneva Accords of 1962. This accord basically said that the nation of Laos needed to remain neutral. And so that, no external forces should be interfering with Lao independence. However, that was just not the reality of it. There were quite a few North Vietnamese soldiers in Laos at the time. And also there were strong alliances between the Laotian communist factions with not only North Vietnam but also China. So it was anything but neutral in Laos. But with the U.S., the Americans were already in Vietnam, heavily involved there. And so it just made more sense to just keep operations secret in Laos, which they did. And so there were tons and tons of bombs dropped in Laos, more than any other war or era in the history of American military involvement.
That's interesting that you point that out. I can imagine that there might be some listeners saying, okay, why would Laos be involved? But if you look at location, how is Laos positioned in regard to Vietnam?
Laos is positioned in a spot where it's right next to Laos, and it would be convenient for the North Vietnamese to use Laos to transport weapons to the south. And, many of us know of that as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they did. Much of the Mien and Hmong involvement in the war had to do with just interrupting some of that activity along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
So the communist forces would use the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fight the war with the U.S.?
Yes, they would be moving soldiers, weapons, just anything they could by using that trail just to get things to the south or South Vietnam.
And they call it the Secret War because it was never really declared as part of the Vietnam War?
Not just that, it was an unofficial war, and also it wasn't made public, in America. Most Americans at the time really had no idea what was going on in Laos. The same thing can kind of be said for Cambodia too. We had a lot of covert operations there as well. And so part of the covert operations in Laos involved recruiting Mien militias. And that's what they did up in the north, where many Mien soldiers were organized into this militia.
And oftentimes I hear people talk about Mian and Laotian. Are they different?
Yes and no.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, in Laos, Laos is a very diverse country with multiple ethnic groups. You can say it's comparable to the U.S., just like how we have numbers of, many ethnic groups here. So in Laos, you have, the dominant Lao population or Lao ethnic group, and then you also have a lot of smaller ethnic groups, such as the Mian, the Hmong, the Tailu, Aka. So there's just numerous different ethnic groups, especially in the north, in the mountain areas of the north.
One question I want to ask you. So a person could be living in Laos and be Mian, but they identify as Mian, not Laotian.
Yes,
Okay.
we would identify ourselves as Laotian, but not Lao. Lao is the technical term for the Lao ethnic group. So Laotian is more comparable to the term American.
Okay, that makes sense. So this it's interesting these covert operations were going on, and you mentioned a few moments ago about this comment about the bombing. Sound like there was a significant amount of bombing happening to Laos.
Yes, there was. I think I had also mentioned that, in the history of war, the most bombs were dropped in Laos than any other war that has been documented. Much of it was pretty much to disrupt the movement of North Vietnamese soldiers and weapons. The unfortunate thing about this is that many of those bombs did not explode. So in the country of Laos, there's still tons and tons of bombs that are still there that haven't been exploded. And then there have been many accidents and deaths because of that, still today.
So, despite I think the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and this is now the 2017, and to think that there's still bombs present and still people being injured. There's not a war going on, but there's people there, and civilians are being injured.
Yes, to put it into perspective, it's kind of like we went over there and created a big old mess, and we didn't clean it up after that.
Yeah. So, for people of Mian, Laotian, that whole region of the world, why did they come here as refugees? Why did your families come here as refugees?
Well, when after the war ended, when the Pathet Lao faction claimed total victory, it was really during that moment when the mass exodus took place in Laos. Where not just the Mien, but Lao, like a number of ethnic groups that fought on the side of the United States, needed to escape, or else they would face death or re-education camps. And most of us chose Thailand as our destination. Now, the Thai government, they accepted us, but they didn't necessarily want everybody to be Thai citizens. I don't want to give the wrong impression. The Thai government and Thai people were very gracious in allowing just thousands and thousands of refugees to pour in. And with the help of the United Nations, they set up numerous refugee camps in Thailand.
So let me ask you a question. So there's communist forces fighting the U.S., and then people from that region that were in favor of democracy were soldiers right alongside the United States soldiers.
Yes. Part of why the Mien and Hmong and others joined the U.S. is, I can speak for the Mien in that we've always enjoyed a certain amount of freedom in the mountains. In fact, that's kind of why we just started from central China and then just started moving down to Southeast Asia during the centuries, because we didn't want to be controlled by governments like the emperors in China and a lot of the governments in Southeast Asia. So the mountain life was our ideal life. And so when the communists came over and kind of introduced their doctrines, we just really weren't in it. It goes against everything that we kind of lived for and believed in. And so it made sense to align with the United States and fight against communism.
And when you talk about mountain people, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean, I think of from Reading, a person might consider them an outdoors or mountain person because they go up and they hike in the woods.
Mountain people it's a type of lifestyle that is, you can say, pre-industrial. They wouldn't have any electricity. They wouldn't really have any indoor plumbing. They are only connected through the urban centers, through markets, food markets, any kind of sales kind of market. But for the most part, mountain people stayed in the mountains because it still is not very easy to just move around from one town to another in the mountains. So it's very rural. It's a completely different lifestyle than the urban centers of Laos.
Or that we might know in the United States. So what would housing be like for mountain people?
Well, they would have to build everything on their own. They would have to acquire the materials on their own. So it would be like us, say if we're living in Reading, it would be like us moving into the mountains of the Shasta Lake Forest area and finding everything that we needed to build a house and building it there in the mountains.
So the food sources that they had came from the land.
Yes.
And were they gardeners? Are they gardeners?
Yes. They in the villages in the mountain areas, they would have some crops around the houses, but in the mountains they would have had to find land elsewhere.
Yeah.
Larger pieces of land where each family could claim a plot.
Yeah.
And that's how most people got their food, is just by claiming plots in the mountains. And there was no one telling them they couldn't. It was kind of more like a first come first serve type of thing.
Yes. So the three of you are here in the studio, so I want to pause for a moment and I want to ask you, David, your family history, thinking back to your family and why they came to the U.S., your personal family history. How old were you when you came to the U.S.? Who was in your family that came as a refugee?
Well, I was technically conceived in a refugee camp in Thailand, but I was born a few months right after we landed in the U.S. In fact, my mom had to lie to officials saying that she wasn't pregnant because they wouldn't have let her get on the plane if they would have known she was pregnant. So I was conceived there, but we had come with pretty much all of my family, both on my mom's side and my father's side.
Their parents?
Yes, we had all came at the same time around 1980.
So how about aunts and uncles and cousins? Just grandparents?
Everyone.
Everyone?
All of my dad's brothers and sisters came at the same time. On my maternal side, it was the same situation as well.
So your family came because why?
Well, we have been applying for political asylum for a long time, since entry into refugee camps in Thailand. So it took about 5 years for that to really happen, maybe 4 years or so, and then the U.S. was one of the countries that said, we're willing to take you guys in.
Yeah, but you left Laos and went to Thailand to a refugee camp and then to the United States because of why?
We, in many ways, we really didn't have anywhere to go. Like
Did you have any family in the military though?
Not necessarily. Oh yes, you mean the Mien militia? Yes, two of my uncles fought in the Mien militia.
So what would have happened had you guys stayed there?
They would have probably been put into a re-education camp or murdered if they didn't escape. When the Laotian communist soldiers came into the villages, that was the first thing they did, was they tried to round up anybody that had any connection with the U.S. government,
Yes.
whether it was civilian ties or military ties. And so my uncles definitely would have gotten killed.
Yeah. So for safety sake,
Hmm.
your family was forced to flee from their home country and go into Thailand for a refugee camp, and then later on through time ended up in the United States, and later through greater time ended up in Reading. So I want to take a moment too and talk to Philip and Mickey, thinking back on your family history. For you, Philip, um, who in your family originally came? Were you born in the United States, kind of like what David shared? You just see that as a snapshot.
Yes. First, I'd like to just thank Lynn and this opportunity I have to just share part of our history and that could be a great encouragement to everyone that's listening. So yes, to answer your question, Lynn, my father was part of the Vietnam War during that time. He was actually a very young man, and he was involved in actually 2 deployments during that time with the CIA U.S. forces, and that would be the main reason why we were able to come to America. And what was your other question?
Well, I was wondering, you didn't come here just because you wanted to relocate to the United States. You came for safety reasons as
Yes.
refugees.
Yes, we did. And so maybe going back a little bit, before the end of that war, my parents, I wasn't born in that time, but my parents and my older sister, and I think, yes, just my sister, they fled Laos, northern Laos, into northern Thailand for safety reasons. As David had mentioned earlier, anyone that was associated with the CIA or the U.S. side, they would be captured and most likely killed or put into prison or concentration camps. So before the end, they fled when they heard word that, okay, we need to move, we need to get out of this area or else we will die, basically. All of them fled to northern Thailand seeking refuge.
And then eventually, through time, ended up in the United States.
Yes, eventually they lived there. They lived in northern Thailand for a good number of years, and then I was born, and then during that time, they started applying for immigration to come to the United States.
So you were born in a refugee camp?
I was not born in the refugee camp. I was born in the northern part of Thailand, and then after I was born, it was a couple years after that when they started applying. So I was, a little boy,
Okay.
about 5 years old during this time when we stayed in 2 refugee camps, and it was about a year period during those camps, and then we came to the United States.
Do you recall being in the camps?
Yes, I do. I recall several memories. One, when we were entering the Thai refugee camps, we had to go through a process where all the families would have to stay in a jail to kind of start the paperwork in a sense. And so I remember in the jail bars and many families being there as well, but we had to stay there for a time. And then after that, you went into the camps. And, for me as a young boy, it seemed kind of normal in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Where,
That's all you knew.
Yeah, that's all I knew. And so, the kids and I, my brothers and I, we would kind of maintain like a normal life in a sense where, we would, go swim in there's a creek nearby, and my brother and I would swim and just have fun there. And also I remember just, going around in the area, in the camp, looking for mango seeds because after we collected the mango seeds, we would go exchange them for cookies, and so that was kind of like our job on
I
the
love
side.
that.
So just things like that, and I also remember during that time where we stayed, food would be rationed to each of the families, depending on the number of family members they had. And so I have this distinct memory of watching the food being delivered, like fish, sardine, or chicken, and they would pull or pick the sardine fish off of the blocks of ice that they delivered them in. And so I just remember that, and they would ration the food to each one, and rice as well. And so if you had 2 people, it seemed like you had just a tiny bit of food. But if you had a family like our family, we would get more. But just memories like that.
So somewhere in the during our program, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I'm going to ask you, when you think back at being about 5 years old and this scenario in the camps and life away from your home country, did you ever feel afraid?
That's an interesting question, in that in many ways I did not feel afraid. It was just life. I knew, we were going through camps, and I knew that was different than life before the refugee camps. But for me, I really don't remember having any sense of fear in that sense. In that, I just kind of kept moving as moving on with life. And so maybe the only part that was scary was, that I can remember, is one time my brother and I were swimming in the creek in the refugee camp, and I went a little too far in the river, and I lost my footing, and I remember just struggling to stay on top of, stay afloat, and so that's probably the only fear that I had during this whole time, was that I was going to die or drown. And thankfully my brother was there to push me out. But in a sense, maybe besides the jail part, seeing that image and
the bars,
the bars, and seeing actual prisoners being transported, maybe that was scary. But in the sense of coming to America, it was a sense of excitement that's going to be new, and apprehension maybe. But in terms of fearing for my life, I didn't really have those feelings.
I'm wondering too if you have enough memory, or your parents have shared with you enough, to kind of describe the refugee camp. Was it fenced? Like, oftentimes we think of the concentration camps that have been depicted in other war times. Do you have any memory, or do you recall stories where they talked about the conditions of the camps?
Yes, that I can remember. I know that they were very strict in keeping people. You had to stay in, and you couldn't freely go in and out. And I heard stories where people would sneak out, and maybe Mickey can share more of that later. But I know that the male, the fathers, or any adult or kind of older males would have to stand guard during that time. They would have their station time where they have to be on guard to kind of protect the community. And so I know that was there, and so those 2 specifics that I can remember.
So let me clarify something too. When they were standing guard, who were they protecting the community from?
I would say that they would protect from maybe other those that maybe wanted to come in to maybe harm anyone, or steal, or loot, or do things that would harm the community.
Just bad people.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's a daunting story. I think many people do not recognize that the United States had soldiers, Mien, Laotian, all those that participated to fight for democracy, and as a consequence had to leave their home countries and flee. And what we're talking about here is going to Thailand and being in these refugee camps long before coming to the United States. So Mickey Chao, you and Philip are married.
Yes.
You're Laotian, and tell us about your kind of history. Were you born in the U.S.? What's your story? What's the impact?
Well, thank you, Lynn, for having us here. We appreciate the opportunity to share our story. I was born in Laos, and when I was born, my father became a soldier because his older brother did not want to become a soldier, so he had to go in place of his brother. And my father became a soldier in 1970, and when I was, and then got married with my mom in 1975. And by when I'm about almost 3 years old, 2.5 to 3 years old, I never met my father because he was in the concentration camp or the re-education camp, being an ally to the American, fighting alongside the Americans. And so I was born in Laos.
Can I ask you a question? Mm-hmm. So your father was captured by the communist forces?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. I just want to make sure I heard that right.
Yes. And
You have never met him?
I met him after around 2.5 years old.
He was released?
Correct.
Okay.
And I left when I was probably around 5 years old from Laos with my family. My parents basically sold whatever they had and to buy tickets on a boat to go across the Mekong River with the hope of going into the refugee camps for safety.
And the refugee camps were where?
In Thailand.
Thailand
in
also.
Nong Khai, yes.
Yeah. So when you think back about life and you hear the stories your parents have told, what were your living conditions when you lived in Laos? Were you part of the mountain people?
No, we were in. I was born in Luang Prabang. Vientiane is the capital of Laos. Luang Prabang is considered the royal city, and so we live in homes made out of bamboo, and we had our own land. I remember an incident where I would go to my grandparents' house and they would have a mango tree, and they would pick the ripe mango and put some sticky rice in there, warm sticky rice, and the sweetness and the taste of it. And for me, being in the U.S. now, I recall memories of that, and I wish that one day, I can go back to that area to see if my grandparents' home is there, or to see if that mango tree is still there from that memory. But we had a garden, we had a farm, rice farm, corn farm. I remember having to watch my sister in a little hut while my parents are, farming.
Yes.
So that was my responsibility, and the refugee life was very different.
I can imagine. We're going to take about a 4-minute break to hear from our advertisers and sponsors, and then we'll come right back. And I'm going to invite our listeners. We're here in conversation with David Saechao. He's the co-chair of the Shasta County Mien community, along with Philip and Mickey Chao. Philip is of Mien descent, and Mickey's Laotian. And we're going to talk more about the Secret War and about their family histories, how they came to the United States, how different life is. And I think it's important for us as listeners to understand that many people don't even understand how the Mien, Laotian, many of the people from that whole region of the world came to the United States because they participated in the Vietnam War in support of democracy and had to flee to come to the United States. So we have very interesting conversations. I'm going to invite you to come right back to enjoy exceptional living. Welcome back to Enjoy Exceptional Living. I am Lynn Fritz, your program producer and host. This program is in collaboration with Enjoy Magazine, KLXR 1230 AM radio, and myself, a private practice licensed marriage and family therapist. In each of our programs, we hope to bring to our listeners programs that they will enjoy and programs that we think are exceptional. Today we are in conversation with three individuals that have an extraordinary personal family history coming to the United States as refugees from the secret war in Laos, which happened the same time the Vietnam War was transpiring. Unfortunately, many people have never heard of the secret war. And so I'm going to ask David Saechao, as the co-chair for Shasta County Mien community. You represent them, but you also represent being able to share the history about the secret war. Can you, in case someone's tuning in for the program to the very first time, can you, just in short form, what is this secret war?
Well, during the Laotian Civil War, the United States decided to employ covert operations in Laos, and part of that was the CIA recruiting militias. The Mien were among one of the militias that was organized and recruited, and so me, myself, and Philip and Mickey, we all have family members and uncles, fathers that were in these wars. And so around 1975, that is when the Pathet Lao faction really won the war in Laos. And that's when most of us had to flee at that time. We fled into Thailand, crossing the Mekong into numerous refugee camps. And from there, around the late 70s is when many groups were granted political asylum and able to immigrate to the West. Not just to the United States, but other Western countries too, like in Europe, Canada as well.
And so, out of a need to be safe, really, if your family stayed in your home countries, they would have been put into re-education camps or executed.
Yes, around 1975, I have my uncle told me many stories of families that tried to escape but were not successful, and so they had to go back into Laos. And what happened is there are numerous stories of older men being abducted late at night, and families would just not see them ever again. And it was mostly because there were some Mien and others that had switched sides at that time because they knew the war was lost. And they switched sides, and then I guess you can say that they started tattling on who was involved with the CIA, who wasn't, and so there were a number of people that were killed around that time, around 1975.
You know, I appreciated in our first segment you were talking about simply by nature, the people valued freedom. And so it was natural to align with the U.S. that was promoting democracy. And the Vietnam War was very controversial in the United States, and for many people it still is. But I think what's important for our listeners to know is, there's a whole community of people in that whole region that joined in the fight for democracy, no matter how somebody feels about the Vietnam War. And because of that, had to leave because communism was taking over, and for their participation, many were executed. And their families would, be persecuted for their role. When you talked about family members being recruited for the militias, what was the role of the militia? Did they practice in preparation for the war? Or did they actually fight?
Yes, there were a number of roles. For example, one of my uncles was actually more of a medic. So he was trained by American organizations in Laos to become a medic and aid those that got hurt. So he wasn't necessarily in combat roles, but he was out there with them.
Yes.
And then my oldest uncle on my father's side, he was actually a combat soldier. So he was trained in one of the designated headquarters for the Mien militia. In fact, he still has a piece of scrap metal I think in his left arm. It was from a bomb that blew up near him. And so they did engage in numerous battles. Sometimes it would just be to guard Mien villages. And then sometimes they would be sent out to actually interrupt, movement of communist soldiers. And sometimes they even fought Chinese soldiers, because the Laotian, the Pathet Lao faction was closely aligned with the North Vietnamese and Chinese. And so...
The communist forces.
Yeah, communist forces. And, there's a story of some of my uncle's friends or comrades or soldiers that were engaged in a battle with Chinese communist soldiers, in which it was just more of like a firing back of missiles. The Chinese communist soldiers kept on bombarding their headquarters with bombs.
Wow.
And so finally, some of the Mien soldiers gathered enough missiles to fire back. So it's just like these kind of battles. Some of them were really bad. Some of them were minor. But yeah, definitely a lot of engagement there.
I think what's important for our listeners, too, is to understand, like any military operation, personnel is used in lots of different ways. And so even if no one had taken arms and fought physically or served with the military, just supporting democracy and the CIA put them at jeopardy. And that's why they had, the people had to leave and flee and go into the refugee camps and eventually coming to the U.S. At the last part of our last segment, towards the end of it, I was talking with Mickey Chao, and we were describing for our listeners your family history and having to leave. And your life was a little different than, the more mountain people that, live more rural and more pre-industrial style of living. And when you think about the stories that you've been told and about the life and the changes that your family's gone through, of the stories that you recall, what's the one that stands out to you, one of the stories? I'd like you to share that.
Oh, just what my parents went through
Yes.
in coming to the U.S. I think it was just the hardship of leaving your home, your memory, the place that you were born.
Way of life.
Yes, way of life, lifestyle, your family. My parents have family members that are there that I've never met because I don't recall. I left when I was 5.
Yeah.
My siblings don't recall how they even look like physically. We've seen pictures because my parents have communicated with them, but just their lifestyle, the freedom that they had to farm as they like, grow things as they like. Life in America is it's different than that. So I think for my family is just leaving the home that you knew, that you love, the land that you love, but you have to choose. You have to choose the well-being of your family for safety, desiring to have a better life, and for my father being a part of the war, coming to America was the life that he needed as a safe haven for him and his family.
In his stories and his sharing with you, I don't know, Binky, have you gotten a sense of how he felt about the war? Did he regret fighting for democracy?
I don't think there's a regret. I think that he has a hard time because they never had time to heal. It was boom, boom, boom. You're out of the concentration camp. You got to find a new way for your family. Leaving, selling all that you have, going to the refugee camp, trying to come into America. So I don't think for him it was a regret because he wanted freedom for his family. He wanted freedom for his country. He wanted to, he's proud of that, and we're proud of him. But I think that he still is going through it. Even me interviewing him and wanting to know more of the story, I think he had a hard time sharing because he has not fully had an opportunity to share his story, to go through the healing process as well.
Pretty daunting journey to go through. We're talking about your family, but all the families, having to flee. And, it helps you for me personally, when you share your story, it helps me to understand how it is for people when, there's different groups around the world at any given time that have to flee their homeland in order to be safe and to give up a way of life that you can never really get back. I mean, even if you return, it's not the same. Have your parents or you gone back to your country?
Yes, I have. After college, I didn't want to go and get a master right away, so I just said, you know what, I want to do something. I want to do something different. And so I went back through an organization here in the States to teach English in Bangkok. It's not Thailand, but during my time there, I went back to Laos. And I had a culture shock. Because I grew up as an American. And so I'm thinking, I'm American. Why can't you see that I'm American and they see an Asian girl who looks exactly like them? Maybe when I speak my language, it felt like weird, this girl's not right in her like tone or something. But I did have an opportunity and to hop on a bicycle and see how it is because I don't recall. I don't remember a lot of buildings. I don't remember. Things has changed, since we left in, when I was 5 years old. So I did have an opportunity to go back and to speak the language again. I think it helped me to be proud of that. Like, it's part of me because I think when I came to the U.S. when I was new, I wanted to be this, blonde hair, blue eye girl. I want to fit in with every American, and I tried to distance myself. But I think going back really helped me to see and to realize how proud I should be of my parents coming to the U.S. without knowing English, walking everywhere without knowing how to drive. It helped me to appreciate my culture and my heritage as well.
Learning a completely new way of life must have been very daunting. So you've been in the U.S. how long? Because our listeners can't
Over 20 years.
Yeah.
I won't say.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I guess somebody can probably tell how old I am by doing the date.
You're very beautiful.
Thank you.
And, time slips away. I could sit and talk with all three of you forever. But I also don't want our listeners miss the opportunity to share in something that's very unique about your history and your relationship with your husband. So can you share with our listeners, because you are Laotian and he is Mien.
Correct.
And is that unusual?
For me, it's unusual. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I had a lot of Korean friends. I had a lot of Vietnamese friends. I had a lot of Caucasian friends. I only know 2 Mien people that was in college, and that's our mutual friends.
That's funny.
And so through them is how I've come to, be married and live here in Reading.
So that's funny. So through college, Washington, D.C., you grew up there.
Yes.
Philip, where did you grow up? Because that makes a difference.
When we came to America, we had sponsors, relative in Reading, and so it was my father's brother. He married into the family, so kind of it was half brother, step brother, kind of something like that. And so they sponsored us. So we came, we flew, started in Bangkok, went to Hong Kong area, and then flew across the Pacific Ocean to Seattle, Washington, to San Francisco, and then to Reading. So we came straight to Reading. So I basically grew up in the Reading area. Lived in Cottonwood for a little bit during my middle school and high school years. But I basically grew up in Reading during this whole time after we came to America.
So when you think about, have you been back to visit your country?
I have not been back,
Okay.
but in my heart, I've always wanted
Uh-huh.
to see, where my
Roots.
my roots, where my parents were born in Laos and where I was born in Thailand. So I've always wanted to do that, and I hope in the near future I can do that, and just to see what it was like, and because that is a part of my past in that that's where I was born, and so but I just have not had the opportunity and the right time to do that.
So she's back there in Washington, D.C. How'd the two of you, you're in Reading, she's in Washington, D.C. How did you get to meet and spend time?
I will let Mickey start that part.
Okay.
How did I get here? Okay, so like I said, our mutual friends, May and Ton, kept inviting me. He would call me. We haven't seen each other for over 10 years, after graduation. And but Ton would call me and say, "Hey, how are you doing? Are you married? What's going on?" Like a good older brother, even though we're not blood related. And I said, "No, I'm not married." And he goes, "Well, you got to be where they are if you want to get married." I said, "I'm okay. I love what I do. If I'm going to get married, that person needs to be here," kind of thing. And so they kept inviting me. Long story short, they kept inviting me to come, and I said, "Okay, I'll be in LA, so I'll stop by." So I came Labor Day weekend for a couple of days.
And that's how the two of you met. You came to the West Coast.
That's right. So she came to the right place because I was here in Reading. And so when I found out that Mickey was coming, I was like, okay. Because I had seen, I read her profile in the ministry that she was working with. And so I kind of had an idea of, what she was doing and, her heart for, the organization that she was a part of. And so I was like, that really stood out to me. But in a sense, I also felt like, what she's doing and the role that she had in the organization, I was like, wow, I kind of felt like she was kind of above, like my reach in a sense. But when I found out that she was coming, I was like, well, hey, here's an opportunity, and I want to get to know her, and I knew that she was coming to Reading, so I was kind of like mentally prepared. Okay, I have a short window to get to know her, to see if she's the kind of person that I would be interested in, pursuing and be in a courting relationship.
I'm curious. Was it usual for you to marry someone within your own culture, or to marry outside is taboo? How was that?
For me, I've always I always picture myself marrying a Mien person. From my parents, they really didn't say, oh, you have to marry someone that's Mien, you have to marry someone that's from Southeast Asia, or they didn't really, give me a hard time or, advise me in a sense. So I basically had, freedom in that sense to choose. So, but generally, it seems that, in the Mien culture, you would marry someone that's Mien. Maybe that was back in Thailand, Laos. I think that's the kind of the cultural norm. But in America, it's becoming very diverse. So, it's not abnormal in a sense where you would marry someone outside of your culture.
Yeah. How about for you, Mickey? Were you looking for someone that was more from your region of the world, your ancestral region?
No. I was the Asian girl that said, I'm not marrying an Asian guy. Because I don't want to be the typical Asian wife that cooks and clean and he sits on the couch and chat with other Asian men. So I was like, I dated Caucasian guys. I grew up in that environment, and I was like, they treat me as equal, and I'm not going for an Asian guy. But my parents, my sister is, married to an African American. My brother's married to a Caucasian lady. So our house,
very
it's like
diverse.
very diverse. And my dad said, "Can you please just keep it Asian?" And I just said, No, but you know,
But it worked out.
Yes, it did. It
Yeah.
did, and Phil has great qualities that I above what I even ask for, and I think the benefit of having to be married to somebody who's Asian is you eat a lot of similar things.
Uh-huh.
Culturally, you know you go through a lot of the same things.
Yes. You can relate to
Yes,
each other.
we can relate to each other, and so I think it's been a good thing.
Well, one of the questions I want to ask, coming to the United States and letting go of the way of life you had and your families had, excuse me, your ancestors had, and becoming more westernized, have you retained any of your cultural identity? Are there things about your culture that you have hung on to that are important and significant to you? I'll start with you, Philip Chao, first.
Yes, to answer your question, the cultural identities for me and my family would be maintaining the language, the Mian language. And so, thankfully, since I was, fairly young, or I was old enough to, retain the language in Thailand, and then coming to America, to Reading, at home, the Mian language was basically the only language spoken. And so, my siblings and I, we spoke to my parents in Mian, and they would do the same to us. And so, through that process, I was able to maintain the language. So that's one aspect of just retaining our cultural identity. And another way for us is, in our faith in God, and where being a Christian, we have the Bible translated into the Mian language. And so, interestingly, for my parents especially, they were, coming to America was such a huge thing for them, in that they had to learn the English language. And to this day, it's very hard for them. They can understand, like conversational English, and be literate in a sense where they could talk to, someone that's American enough. But when you start going to deeper, like paperwork or just deep vocabulary, that's where it will become very difficult. So,
Struggle, yeah.
So a struggle. But for them, they learn to be literate through the Bible, because they learn, the sounds and how, the written form in Mian using English Roman letters. So it's very, very interesting for them, where they get to retain that, reading and writing in Mian. And for them, I think that's a great accomplishment for them, where they are literate.
That's wonderful.
And for them to read and understand. So that's great. So that's another aspect.
So how about for you, Mickey Chow? Thinking about the cultural identity from your perspective, Philip mentioned language and faith. What else?
I think another, for us, our family is, when we first came, my dad was like, no English in our house. We only speak our language. And now they have changed. It's like Lao and English mixed together,
There you go.
But I think for us is retaining the food, like our way of the recipes that has been passed on to my mom, to my dad, and me learning it and using some of the things that I the plant that they grow in the backyard, gardening in the backyard, finding ways to retain some of the lifestyle that we had through food and gardening, and the language is one. And then for me now is being proud of that, because like I said, I wanted to be the blonde hair, blue eye kind of girl, but now I kind of come to appreciate some of those things that I hope to pass on to our children as well.
So where do you grow things in the backyard? Do you also shop someplace where you can find foods?
Yes.
Where is that?
In Reading, you mean?
Yes.
Well, there are some local Asian stores like Kanya Market, right? The Lao Market near Racha Noodles. So and then I think a lot of places like Food Max, Winkle, other places provide and are targeting more like Mian and Lao and
Yes.
ethnic groups as well. So that aisles with the noodles and the aisles with like bitter melon, different things like that we can't grow. Well, I can't, but my
Yeah.
in-laws can. But those are some places, and I think that helps providing those things. You see that Shasta County and the people are providing and seeing the significant amount of Mian and Lao people that desire those items. I think
Yes.
it's great to provide those things
Oh,
for us.
absolutely.
Yeah. So that we're not only going to, like an Asian grocery store, but they see that we shop in those stores as well.
And I know when you're in other communities, like as an example, Berkeley, you can go to the markets there, and there's a whole spectrum of foods. It's not just the typical Western type of food. We're almost out of time, so David, when you think of cultural identity for you, what have you been drawn to?
Definitely like Mickey and Philip, definitely language. It's one of those things that I've always tried my best to retain, trying to retain the Min language. But I think also just a shared history and just not really ever forgetting where you come from. Just last year, around November, I was actually in a village in northern Laos. And what was interesting is that there were a lot of Mien villagers there in northern Thailand
Uh-huh.
that were among the group that didn't make it to Thailand. And so it kind of dawned on me, that these are the this is a group of Mien people that could have had the same opportunities as us, but for whatever reason they didn't make it. And it also dawned on me that no matter how far apart we are, we're always going to be connected in a certain way. And it really kind of hit me when I came back to the United States that, we have this shared history. And, for me, I'm going to do whatever I can to just make sure that we don't forget about that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wanted to ask you, David Saechao is the co-chair for the Shasta County Mien community. Give a phone number for our listeners in case they wanted to contact you and with questions.
Yes, my phone number is 530-410-1097. You can also find us on Facebook at Shasta Mien.
I think it's wonderful. I want to thank all three of you for coming in and sharing your stories, and we're going to have you back soon because I know you have a lot to share, and I thank you for being so open and being vulnerable. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in, and I want to encourage you to remember to greet all the people in our community, no matter how different they may look from ourselves, that we're all part of making this an exceptional place to live. I also want to remind our listeners, make this day and every day a day to enjoy exceptional living.